Hello, everyone. Apologies for cancelling our last lecture. As I mentioned at the time, and as you can probably tell from my voice, I haven't been well, and unfortunately, I had to postpone our last lecture. And it's taken me a few days to actually be able to record this, but here it is. So I may have to take a pause now and then to cough or sneeze or some other icky cold related thing. So I apologise. Sorry, like that. So, anyway, it's definitely a lot better for you if I do this online or in a recording rather than you being right in front of me. So, let's begin. So today I'm talking about disability equality. So I'm going to have a look at the law as we do every session. We're going to have a look at what is disability and what is ableism, and we're going to think about disability inclusion in education. Now, this lecture is a bit shorter than the ones we usually do, just because we do a lot of kind of group work and discussions and so on, and obviously we can't do that when it's recording. So, yeah, whatever time is left, you can just use that to maybe do your assignment or something else. But what we'll do at the end of this is so when we see each other next week, we will have a chat about these and the one from the previous week about the skills, the intercultural skills. We can have a talk about those and any questions you have and kind of talk about the assignment and all those things as well. We can do that next week, okay? So, it's considered discrimination when there's less favourable treatment of one person compared to another, because one person has a disability and the other doesn't, or the other has a different disability. So both of those are forms of discrimination. Now, the Education Act 1998 emphasises the rights of children with disabilities and with other special educational needs. It gives constitutional protection to the rights of children, for the educational rights of disabled children, and it provides for appropriate level and quality of education for each person, and that's for the needs and abilities of them. It also promotes equality of access and participation so that everyone has access to education. And it means that the Minister for Education should ensure everyone has access to education that meets their needs. However, as you may be aware, and it has been in the news a little bit recently, there is very little consideration given into where those school places are. So while the Minister for Education has to make sure there is a place for every child, there's no kind of consideration that that place has to be within a certain distance of the house or any of those kind of things. So it could be that a child in Dublin, the only school place may be down in Kerry, which isn't really very feasible. So is that considered accessibility and inclusion? I don't know. What do you think? Have a think about that for yourselves. So, how that's applied in education. So, educational establishments are not allowed to discriminate on the grounds of disability in relation to admission of students, terms of admission, access to courses, facilities, or benefits, or expulsion or sanction of a student. An educational establishment is private and public preschools, primary schools, post-primary, further higher education, and any other third-level institutions, both private and public. The only time there is an exemption to the disability law is when compliance would make it impossible or have a very severely detrimental effect on services supplied to other students. So while it's really important to be accessible and inclusive for student disabilities, you can't mean that other students, it can't be other students' detriment, basically. Now, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities says that people with a disability shall not be excluded from the general educational system on the basis of the disability, and that they have to be able to access an inclusive, quality, and free primary and secondary education on an equal basis with others within the community that they live in. Ireland must also provide reasonable accommodation of that person's requirements, and ensure that people receive the support they need within the education system. Ireland must ensure that the education of people who are blind, deaf, or deaf and blind is delivered in the most appropriate languages and modes and means of communication, which means they need to facilitate the learning of Irish Sign Language and promotion of the linguistic identity of the deaf community. It's also important, and it covers that teachers should be qualified in Irish Sign Language or Braille. So, what is disability? Sorry, 1 second. So, a disability, and this is according to the World Health Organization, a disability results from the interaction between individuals with a health condition, such as cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, or depression, with their personal and environmental factors, including negative attitudes, inaccessible transportation and public buildings, and limited social support. So that's how the World Health Organization defines disability. There's a few different models of disability, and you may have heard of these before. So the first one I have here is called the medical model of disability. So the medical model is when they consider the impairment or the condition is within the person, that the person has some kind of something wrong with them, and that should be fixed or should be treated by medical intervention. And the medical model looks at what's wrong with someone when they are compared with a non-disabled person. And you can see here that it's very much on the problem is the disabled person, that this person needs to be helped. They are sick and need a cure, and they can't see or hear. They're housebound, they're confined to a wheelchair, and so on. Then the second model is the model of disability, is the social model. So this one considers that disability is caused by how society is organized. So the problem is the world around the person. So rather than it just being in the person, it's around the person. The equality would be achieved by adapting societal barriers to promote equality, and that by doing that it'll create more inclusion. So you can see in that picture there things like badly designed buildings, having stairs without ramps, not having lifts, having special schools, not having enough sign language interpreters, discrimination, inaccessible transport, minimal parking places, isolation, problems with job prospects, and even problems with access to education. Those are disabling, those are barriers for people with disabilities. Now, there's also other models that the way they would look at it is that, yes, there is some kind of disabling condition that is held within the person, but society isn't designed to support that, and changes are needed within the society to reduce the barriers and the challenges for people as well, to create better equality. So there's a human rights model, and the human rights model of disability focuses on equity and equality for everyone. And it believes that everyone has the same rights, and those rights must be applied to everyone. And very importantly, that disabled people are decision makers in their own lives. So disabled people should be talked. Disabled people should be asked for their ideas, their thoughts, what they want, what they need, not talked about. And the human rights model is very transformative. Its aim is to remove unjust systems and unjust practices. So, in relation to the medical and social model, I'd like you to just pause me here for a second, well, if you'd like to, and have a look at these three suggestions and see, do you think these would be the medical model or the social model? So if you pause now and then press play again when you're ready. So hopefully you've paused and played again. If you haven't, that's absolutely fine. So the first one, having a look at these with the medical model and the social model. So a wheelchair user wants to get into a building with a step at the entrance. So with the social model, a ramp would be added to the entrance so that they are free to go into the building immediately. And that means the social model is the way to address that. The medical model looks at treatment, looks at medication or therapies. There is no medication or therapy that can help with that. So the social model is the only one that can reduce that barrier. For the second one, the teenager wants to work towards living independently. So with the social model, the person would be helped to maybe find a job, or to find some way of living independently and making money to pay their rent. In the medical model, the medical model is about the people need support, they need to be cared for. So that wouldn't really be supported, and it would be more likely that this person the suggestion would be that they live in a communal home or a care home where someone can look after them. So there's less independence. And the final one, a child with a visual impairment wants to read the latest best-selling book. So again, the medical model would have very few ways to address that barrier, but the social model, something like even just listening to the book, an audio recording of the book with their friends, so they can talk to their friends about it. That's the social model. So you can see from those three that the social model is about reducing the barriers and about adapting things and changing things. And as educators, you can look at how you educate and how you teach to adapt that and to change things in a very small way. So for example, you can, rather than just giving a reading list or a book, you can also add a video or a podcast of the same book or someone talking about the same book. Rather than just giving out book lists, you could add audio recordings for the books and so on, just to make things a little bit easier, a little bit more accessible. So, ableism is the set of beliefs or practices that devalue and discriminate against people with disabilities. So, it generally stems from good intentions from non-disabled people, and it's very intertwined in our culture. And a lot of that comes from some limited beliefs about what disability does or doesn't mean, which is why I've gone through the medical model and the social model here. Another part of it is, and I mentioned this a little earlier, that disabled people tend not to be included in decisions. And they tend not to be at the table when decisions about being disabled are being made. So there's a lot of talking about them, not to them, or not with them. So ableism, it can show up quite a lot in how people with disabilities are treated and in the language used to discuss disability. For example, things like differently abled, disability with a capital A. I can't think of any others off the top of my head. I'm sure you can think of some, or maybe you'd like to try and think of some. Those are languages used by non-disabled people. And what that does is that gives this idea that being disabled is there's something wrong with being disabled. There's not, it's just a word. It's a word, it means something different. It's like tall, it's a description. So, but that's a form of ableism, to avoid using a word like disability. So ableism is very strong and holds its ground very strongly when non-disabled people are in charge of all the decisions around people with disabilities, and refuse to consider disabled rights. So some ways ableism, you might recognize some of these, is things like, small children sometimes taught to be extra nice to people with disabilities. Why? Everyone should be treated with respect and niceness. There's no reason to treat people differently because of who they are. Things like if a disabled person in a wheelchair is at a lift running and pressing the button for them, they're perfectly capable of pressing the button. If not, then perhaps you could ask, would you like help with that? But there's no need to do it for them. It's taking away someone's autonomy reduces who they are as a person, takes away some of that personhood, and makes them think that they are helpless. There is no need to be nice to one particular group of people, the same way that there is no need to be nice to any particular group of people. So when you focus on being nice to one group of people over another, you reduce who they are, you reduce their humanity and make them seem a little bit more helpless. And it's creating assumptions that these people are unable to manage for themselves. Language, as I said, is a bit of a problem with disability. For example, words like wheelchair bound as opposed to wheelchair user. So have a think about where you've been and things you've done, communities you've been part of or groups and those kind of things, and how many disabled people were in that group. The things you had to do to be part of that group, and how accessible those groups were for disabled people, or how they could have been made more accessible. And then have a think as a teacher or as an educator how you can be more accessible and try to reduce the amount of ableism that you may or may not have. And remember, we all have unconscious biases, but it's important to really think about things like ableism, because a lot of people don't realize that they do have ableism biases within them. So an important point is using inclusive language. So disability isn't a bad word, as I said, and disability is just a characteristic. Avoiding stereotypes, and people like different terms. At the moment, I'm doing some research on disability in online education, and at the beginning of my research, of my interviews, I say to people, would you prefer if I use the term disabled student or student with disability? People like to, sorry, apologies, I've talked too much. People like different terms and they like to be asked which one. I'm just going to pause for a sec. Sorry about that. Just had to cough. Okay, so disability inclusion within education. So the right to education for all, and you can see that has been advocated in several significant international declarations over the past 20 years. However, though this is something that's been advocated for in an awful lot of different places, children with significant intellectual disabilities are at high risk of being excluded from mainstream education and more likely to be educated in special schools or in special classes within mainstream schools. So the Act called Education for Persons with Special Educational Needs was passed into Irish law in 2004. So, according to this Act, all children have the right to primary education, and children with special educational needs have a right to primary education until they turn 18. Special educational needs is a restriction in the capacity of the person to participate in and benefit from education on account of an enduring physical, sensory, mental health, or learning disability, or any other condition which results in a person learning differently from a person without that condition. So it may arise from 4 different areas of disability: physical, sensory, mental health, or learning disability. Sorry, just to correct that. And just to add that that also includes any condition that can result in a child learning differently from a child who doesn't have that condition. It's also important to mention here as well that a child can have a disability but not have any special educational needs that arise from that, and that they may not need additional supports in school. So, some options in education for children who have disabilities. And these are provided for by the Department of Education and Skills. So in schools, there can be mainstream classes, which is a mainstream primary or post-primary school, where the class teacher or the subject teacher has responsibility for the progress of all teachers in the class. And that includes the students with a special educational need, and additional support from a learning support teacher or resource teacher might be provided. Secondly, then there is special classes in mainstream schools. So these would have a lower pupils-teacher ratio, which is specified according to the category of the disability. So the classes may have smaller numbers of pupils. For example, there could be a special class for children with autism that may have one teacher for every 6 pupils. I'm really sorry about my cough. Okay, and the final one of the schools is so a special school that has a lower pupil to teacher ratio specified according to category of disability. So the classes in general have smaller numbers of pupils. So one example of that is a school for children with moderate general learning disabilities could have one teacher for every 8 pupils. Then there's additional support, such as special needs assistance, assistive technology, which provides funding to schools towards purchasing equipment for students that have a special educational need and require specialist equipment. And there is no upper limit on how much they can get from that grant aid. Home tuition, so sometimes children are unable to go to school on a regular basis. They can access home tuition, and that can also be provided if a child has special educational needs and is waiting for a suitable school place. It can also be used to provide early intervention for preschool children with autism. So it's 10 hours a week for children aged 2.5 and 20 hours a week for children aged 3 and over. Okay. So the National Council for Special Education is the body responsible for the improvement of responsible for the improvement of delivering education services to people with special educational needs. So they actually employ over 80 special educational needs organisers, and they are responsible for allocating additional teaching and other resources for children with special educational needs. So, what do they? So they are a point of contact for parents or guardians and schools. They process applications from schools and they decide on the appropriate level of special needs assistance support. They examine applications from schools for special equipment and assistive technology, and then they forward those applications to the Department of Education. They look at applications from schools for transport arrangements for children with disabilities, and again, they make recommendations to the Department of Education and Skills. They identify the appropriate educational setting for individual children with special educational needs, and they also provide advice and support for parents of children with special educational needs. So, the term differentiated curriculum means that teachers adjust their teaching to take account of children's different needs and abilities. So children with more complex needs will have access to individualized educational programs, and children with additional care needs may have access to a special needs assistant where this is necessary and appropriate. And just it's very important to note as well that additional supports are never automatic. So application has to be made to the appropriate agency for those. So a little bit for you to do. So review the case studies in Loop and then consider the strengths, needs, requirements, challenges and barriers for each of these students. And think about what could you as an educator do to address these issues and how can you create disability inclusion in your teaching practice. So there is 4 case studies in Loop, they're linked there. When we see each other next week, we're going to talk about your findings of these and what you found, and discuss your answers to each of those questions. And then just a final note, this is the motto, and it's been used by disabled people's organisations for quite a long time, and it's part of the global movement to achieve full equality for, by and with persons with disabilities. So as you can see, it says nothing about us without us. And the point of that is rather than research or education or talking about people with disabilities and making decisions about them, everything should be done with them in collaboration with disabled people. If you're making decisions about disabled people, they should be there. They should be part of those decisions. So do those case studies and I will see you next week to talk about them, and hopefully I will not be coughing as much. Okay, see you then.